Now, when we are studying the science of math, we study the units involved in measuring things. And one of the first types of units we study is distance. And we can measure distance with how far. So the question of how far, that's a distance. The other thing that we need to pay attention to is direction. And what direction becomes a very different question than how far. They're two completely different things. And so when we're doing math, we have to be able to tell and pay attention to which one of these we're talking about. When we take a measurement, it's fairly easy to say, okay, that distance. But if we start at this point and we go, say 4, we end up at a very different place than if we go 4 that direction. And that's also a very different place from 4 in this direction. The distances are all the same. It's still 4. So if I grab myself a compass, like so, and then I spread the thing out so I can measure a 4, then I can tell that if I travel 4 spaces, I can get anywhere in that circle. So any direction I go, even if I'm going off this direction, that's still 4. Alright? But, so if I can go 4 squares, 4 spaces, 4 feet, and what direction I go makes a really big difference. Now when we are measuring, paying attention to distance or direction, not distance, but paying attention to direction, oftentimes we have, like a compass, we could have a north and a south and a east and a west. I also have an up and a down. So those can make a big difference on where we're at. When we pick a direction and say, okay, I'm going to be going this direction, I can name that direction to be my positive direction. And if I then look at the opposite of east is west, so the opposite of positive is going to be negative. So negative is just opposite. Okay, so if I point to the positive direction and then I want to point negative, I turn around, negative. I turn around to the opposite direction. If I turn around again, now I'm back to positive. So from that, I can determine that a negative, if I put 2 negatives together, that's going to equal a positive. Now, negative, and the way I say that is a negative times a negative equals a positive, because when we put 2 things next to each other, that is multiplication. That's times. Okay, so a negative times a negative is equal to a positive. Because I've turned around once, or turned around halfway, and then halfway again. So I've made 1 revolution if I go a negative times a negative. If I go a negative times a negative times a negative, that's 1, 2, 3 times, turning around 3 times, that's going to equal a negative. If I go one more time around, negative times negative times negative times negative, I'm back in the positive direction. But this is also 2 rotations. This is 1 rotation. Now, if I take something and I multiply it together a whole bunch of times, a negative, or some a times a equals a squared. Well, if a negative times a negative equals a negative squared, which equals positive, negative times negative times negative equals negative to the third, because there's 3 negatives, which equals, ends up being pointing to the negative, because you've got 1 negative, 2 negatives, and 3 negatives. Ends up being pointing in the negative direction. But this negative to the third, that's a rotation. 1, 2, 3, 4 negatives, negative to the fourth. I end up pointing in the positive direction, but there's 2 rotations. If I have a direction raised to an exponent, the exponent, how much rotation? Okay. So that's how far we've rotated. And as we keep rotating, that number goes up. Now, if we wanted to, but the negative, see, this is not really, it's how many half rotations. If we wanted to go how many full rotations, we would need to be counting how many turns. And so there's, but, you know, a positive, that's our starting point. That's our starting direction. So that's like our 0, because if we take a distance, when we have a starting point, that's a 0. If we have a direction, and we have our starting point, that's positive. So we can't very well raise positive to an exponent. So we have to have some amount of rotation that we're raising to an exponent.